Welcome back, you night owls. Tonight we follow the sound of boots crunching over damp earth, the soft rattle of sabers against belts, and the murmur of men who are about to climb yet another hill because someone in a red coat told them to. You stand there at the base of a rise, the smell of wet grass and horse sweat hanging in the air, the kind of smell that seeps into wool and never comes out. The moon is barely above the horizon, just a thin silver grin, and you're in the middle of a field full of tents that look like they've been pitched and struck 100 times before. You probably won't survive this if you were actually there between the mud, the bad food, and the occasional musket ball whizzing by. Life in this camp is about as far from cozy as it gets. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Drop a comment telling me where you are in the world and what time it is as you listen. Are you halfway across the globe at sunrise, or lying in bed with the curtains drawn? Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The first thing you notice is how strange it feels to be following a nursery rhyme into history. The sing-song chant of the grand old Duke of York, he had 10,000 men, seems like something to lull children to sleep, not lead you to a scene where soldiers are shivering in their greatcoats. But there's the Duke's army, or at least the memory of them. A line of troops stretching across the field, drummers keeping time, fifers whistling a thin melody as they prepare to march uphill once again. You step into line, your boots sinking into the cold ground, and you can almost feel the rhythm of thousands of feet moving in unison. It's oddly hypnotic. The world narrows down to the steady pace left, right, and the clank of equipment. And yet, despite the discipline, you can sense a low buzz of frustration running through the ranks. These men have been told to march uphill before, and they have been told to march back down again. And the worst part is that it often doesn't seem to achieve anything. That's where the rhyme comes from, an almost cheeky observation that this Duke's great military maneuvers seem to amount to a lot of exercise and not much else. The rhyme itself has a peculiar endurance. You can still hear children chanting it in playgrounds centuries later, blissfully unaware that they are echoing a piece of military satire. The fact is, the phrase "had 10,000 men" wasn't exactly literal. It was a poetic exaggeration, a way to make the image stick in your mind. 10,000 is a big, round, satisfying number. It sounds impressive, like something that should belong to an epic general, a Caesar, or an Alexander. And yet, here it belongs to a man whose reputation was more complicated. The Duke of York, whose full name was Prince Frederick, was indeed a commander of British forces, and he really did spend time leading men in Flanders during the wars of the late 18th century. You hear the splash of mud underfoot, as the memory of those campaigns overlays itself on the present Belgian fields, damp as ever, swallowing boots whole. It's here that the phrase about marching up to the top of the hill begins to feel like gallows humor. The soldiers who served under him sometimes complained that they were sent forward one day, pulled back the next, and left to wonder what the grand plan was. And there's something very human about that picture, this sense of effort without resolution, of being caught in a loop of action that doesn't quite lead anywhere. You've probably felt that in your own life at some point, putting in work, sweating over a project, and then having to start all over again because someone changed their mind. It's comforting, in a strange way, to know that even in the 1,790 seconds, soldiers were rolling their eyes at orders and grumbling under their breath. The past is closer than it looks. As you follow the column up the hill, the sound of the camp fades behind you. The night air is sharp, carrying the scent of wood smoke and whatever stew is still boiling in the big iron pots near the mess. A dog barks somewhere off to the side, and for a moment you think of home, any home, because that's what soldiers did too, scribbling letters by candlelight that might never make it past the next skirmish. There's a kind of melancholy beauty in this picture. The line of men silhouetted against a sky just starting to lighten at the edges. Historically speaking, the British army of this period wasn't as enormous as the rhyme suggests, but it was growing. Britain was learning to fight wars on a continental scale, fielding bigger and better organized forces than ever before. This was the army that would one day face Napoleon, but right now it was still figuring itself out, still making mistakes. And mistakes, as you might guess, often involve sending men up hills only to bring them back down again. Some historians argue that the rhyme might not even have been about Frederick at first. There were other Dukes of York, after all, including Richard of Shrewsbury, one of the princes in the Tower, and James Stuart, whose military ventures were no less controversial. The debate over which York the rhyme originally mocked is still lively in academic circles. Was it satire aimed at a particular campaign? Or was it simply a catchy way of poking fun at the whole idea of pointless military maneuvers? No one can quite agree, which is part of what makes the story so much fun to tell. You get to imagine several versions at once. Picture it now. A group of camp followers huddled near a fire, making up little songs to amuse themselves, turning the high and mighty into characters of farce. It's almost reassuring that mockery is as old as authority itself. Wherever there's a leader giving orders, there's someone quietly turning those orders into a joke. You can imagine the first time someone said it. The grand old Duke of York, he had 10,000 men, and everyone else smirked into their tankards because they knew exactly who was being roasted. By the time you reach the top of the hill, your breath fogging in the air, you can see why this became such a potent image. There's a view of the whole countryside, rivers winding like silver threads, villages still dark and quiet, but the position is exposed, vulnerable. If there were enemy troops out there, they would see you just as clearly. You stand there for a moment, feeling the wind cut through your coat, and you realize that at some point someone is going to give the order to march down again, and everything will look exactly the same as it did an hour ago. It's almost funny, almost. The soldiers next to you are muttering under their breath, a mix of complaint and camaraderie. You catch one joke about hoping the Duke forgets which way is uphill next time so they can at least get a rest. There's a grumble about boots worn through to the socks. Another about the never-ending rations of salted beef. The humor is sharp but keeps them sane. You feel a kinship with them as you turn back toward camp, beginning the slow trudge downhill. The mud sucks at your heels, threatening to pull your boots off, and the line of men snakes its way back toward the tents where it started. You can't help thinking that this whole scene is a kind of loop, an endless march that will play out again and again until it becomes legend, then rhyme, then bedtime song. The strange thing is that this moment, this back and forth climb, says more about the Duke's story than any heroic painting ever could. History remembers victories and defeats, but it also remembers futility, and sometimes that memory is the sharpest of all. When you next hear the sing-song chant of children reciting the rhyme, you'll know that behind it there were real men, real mud, and a real Duke whose orders were probably more complicated than they sounded, but who still became immortal as the man who made 10,000 men climb a hill for nothing. The hill levels out beneath your feet now, and you are back in the glow of the campfires, the whole world smelling of smoke and wet earth. The soldiers are peeling off their packs, shaking out their coats, and collapsing onto whatever dry patch they can find. Somewhere a fiddler strikes up a tune, and for a few minutes there's a kind of rough cheerfulness in the air. The march is done for now. You stand still, and let the moment sink in. This is where the story really begins, not in the rhyme, not in the history books, but here on the ground, where men lived, and cursed, and laughed, and kept marching because someone had to. The Duke is somewhere in a tent, poring over maps by candlelight, already thinking about the next maneuver. And you, whether you like it or not, are going to be there for the next climb. You wake before dawn, the faint chill clinging to your bones, as you rise and stretch, still feeling last night's march in your calves. The camp is quiet, except for the muffled stamping of horses and the low murmurs of sentries. Somewhere out of sight, a bugle is being polished, ready to blare the day into action. But this morning, you aren't following the troops yet. Instead, you're heading toward a row of finer tents at the center of the encampment, where an officer's guard stands watch, and the air smells faintly of pipe smoke. This is where the man himself is, the grand old Duke of York, the one whose reputation made him both nursery rhyme legend and the butt of a centuries-old joke. He wasn't always grand or old. Frederick, Duke of York and Albany, was born in 1763 as the second son of King George III, which meant he was destined for great importance but not the throne. That was a strange position to be in, close enough to power to be burdened with duty, but far enough that you had to carve out your own legacy somewhere else. For Frederick, that somewhere was the military. You slip inside the mental picture of his early years, a boy in a stiff little coat being drilled in languages and court etiquette, all the while knowing that his elder brother would be king someday. Being the spare in a royal family could be lonely work. Frederick was shipped off to Germany at a young age, as was the Hanoverian custom, to get his military education. Imagine him standing there, a teenager among seasoned Prussian officers, trying to absorb lessons on drilling troops and maintaining discipline while keeping his wig straight. This wasn't summer camp. It was an immersion in the hard, clockwork world of Frederick the Great's army. You can almost hear the barked commands in German, the clash of sabers as the boys practiced maneuvers, the constant emphasis on precision and obedience. The mainstream history books tell you that Frederick thrived there. By his late teens, he was already a major general in the British Army, which sounds impressive until you remember that royal birth came with fast-tracked promotions. It's one of those uncomfortable truths of the era. Noble blood could substitute for years of battlefield experience. His critics would later use that fact as ammunition, calling him a desk soldier who had never earned his stars the hard way. You can sense the tension that would follow him for life, every decision he made scrutinized, every setback blamed on the idea that he hadn't really been a soldier. And yet there's something oddly sympathetic about him. You picture Frederick in his 20s, tall and solidly built, with a serious face and just a hint of weariness in his eyes. He wasn't the flamboyant type like his elder brother, the future George IV, who loved parties and fashion and scandal. Frederick was more reserved, perhaps even shy, and he took the army seriously. This was his stage, the one place where he could make a mark. You can almost feel the weight of that expectation pressing on him. Don't embarrass the crown. Don't make a blunder. Don't be remembered as the royal who failed. The quirky part is that, despite the military rigor drilled into him, Frederick seems to have had a surprisingly soft heart for the men under his command. He was known to improve soldiers' rations, pay attention to their welfare, and even crack a rare joke or two in their presence, small gestures that made him oddly beloved. Some letters from the era mention how approachable he was, how he would ride through the camp and actually listen to what common soldiers said, which was not exactly standard behavior for a prince. You picture him nodding at a grenadier's complaint about damp tents, or smiling faintly at some barracks humor. It's easy to see why some troops liked him, even as others mocked him. Historians still puzzle over whether his reputation as a good duke was earned or carefully managed. Some suggest that reports of his generosity were exaggerated to counterbalance the disasters of his campaigns. A bit of royal spin doctoring centuries before public relations became a profession. Others insist that he truly cared, pointing to reforms he later championed that professionalized the army and improved discipline without turning it into a punishment machine. The truth probably lies somewhere in the middle, as it usually does, but it's fascinating to watch scholars argue about it, as if Frederick might wander in at any moment to settle the debate himself. The camp is stirring now. The guards at the Duke's tent shift their stance, and the flap opens just enough for you to catch a glimpse of him at his desk. Candlelight flickering over maps and correspondence. There's an intensity there, a sense of someone who is not just following orders but shaping them, for better or worse. You imagine him riding to London, reporting on troop numbers, weather, and the endless logistical headaches of feeding and clothing thousands of men in foreign territory. He has to weigh every move carefully, knowing that Parliament and the newspapers will pounce on his mistakes. It's in this moment that you start to understand why the rhyme stuck. He had 10,000 men, isn't just a cute way to count those men were his responsibility, and that was no small thing. 10,000 human lives, depending on your choices, would weigh heavily on anyone's shoulders. Marching them up a hill, and then down again might seem pointless to the outside observer. But to Frederick, it was part of a larger game of chess. A way to keep them safe, to maneuver without committing to a disastrous battle. There's also something almost cinematic about his position. The lone commander, sitting under canvas with rain pattering outside, poring over intelligence reports while the world sleeps. You can smell the ink on the parchment, hear the scratch of the quill as he writes his orders. For a moment, you forget the jokes and the caricatures, and see him as he must have seen himself, a man trying to do his duty as best he could. But of course, duty doesn't protect you from scandal. Frederick's life was punctuated by public drama that threatened to eclipse his military career. The newspapers of the day loved a royal scandal as much as modern tabloids do, and the Duke's name was never far from the gossip columns. Some of the controversies were personal, involving romantic entanglements that raised eyebrows at court. Others were political, involving accusations of corruption and misuse of army funds that would later haunt him. You walk away from his tent as the sun finally breaks the horizon, the light spilling gold over the camp. The men are forming up again, ready to march, but you carry with you a deeper understanding of the man at the center of all this. He isn't just a rhyme or a caricature. He's a prince shaped by duty, a commander trying to balance royal expectations with the messy reality of war, and a man who will spend his whole life walking the fine line between respect and ridicule. As the column moves forward, you fall in beside them once more, boots squelching in the mud. The day is just beginning, and so is the story. Somewhere up ahead lies the first real disaster of his career, the campaign that will make him famous and infamous in equal measure. But for now, you march on, following the Duke who will lead you up the hill once again, and then down, and then back into history where the rhyme will trap him forever. You leave the muddy Flanders morning behind, and drift backward through time, almost as if the rising sun itself were pulling you into a younger, cleaner world. The air smells of beeswax and polished wood now, the sounds of marching boots replaced by the gentle ticking of an ornate clock, and the distant chatter of servants in a palace corridor. You're standing in St. James's Palace in the mid-1760s, peering into the nursery, where the little boy who would become the grand old Duke of York is taking his first hesitant steps. He is Prince Frederick, second son of King George III and Queen Charlotte, and he is dressed exactly as you'd expect an 18th century royal toddler to be: lace, ribbons, and a cap far too fancy for someone who spends most of his time chewing on wooden toys. You crouch down beside him, hearing the soft rustle of his clothes as he stumbles forward, determined not to fall under the watchful eye of his nurse. Childhood in a royal household is not carefree. It is an apprenticeship in public life. Every misstep is observed, every tantrum reported, every charm noted with interest. The mainstream record tells us that Frederick was a bright and lively child, though quieter than his older brother George, the heir to the throne. You can picture the contrast: George, bold and mischievous, grabbing at tutors' wigs and turning lessons into a game, while Frederick sits more seriously at his little desk, tongue sticking out as he copies letters with painstaking care. You can almost feel the subtle pressure placed on him, even at this age, to be the dependable one. If his older brother was destined to be the glittering prince, Frederick would be the steady soldier. Queen Charlotte, their mother, was famously strict but devoted to her children. She believed in education and moral discipline, which meant the royal nursery was no idle playground. Imagine yourself standing against the wall as tutors rotate in and out. Latin scholars, music instructors, dancing masters, all working to shape this boy into someone worthy of his station. There's a harpsichord in the corner, its polished surface gleaming, and sometimes you hear the young prince plinking out hesitant notes between lessons. Childhood here is not about play, it's about preparation. And yet, there were moments of delight. Letters from court mention Frederick's fondness for animals, particularly dogs, and you can almost hear the excited yips of a small spaniel tearing across the room as the prince laughs one of those rare, unguarded bursts of joy. It's a reminder that even princes were children once, with scraped knees and favorite pets, and a longing to escape lessons and run in the garden. But the path for a second son was already mapped out. Britain was a country that prided itself on its army and navy, and it was understood that a younger prince would serve as a military leader, even if his actual combat experience would be limited at first. This was not unusual. Across Europe, royal families used younger sons as generals, bishops, or diplomats. Anything that allowed them to serve crown and country without threatening the line of succession. Frederick's destiny was already hanging over his crib. The quirky part of his upbringing is that, despite the strict schedule, he was apparently a cheerful boy with a knack for winning over adults. There are anecdotes of him charming household staff and coaxing a smile from stern-faced tutors. One diary entry from a visiting dignitary describes him as a most agreeable and intelligent child, which is court language for, this boy knew how to make a good impression. You picture him practicing bows in front of a mirror, eager to get it right, because even as a child he knew that people were watching. Historians still argue about how much freedom royal children really had. Some insist that the palace was essentially a gilded cage, their every moment choreographed. Others claim that George III and Queen Charlotte tried to create as normal a family life as possible within the constraints of royalty, walking with the children in the gardens, encouraging them to play together, and even insisting on bedtime stories. The truth may be somewhere between. A boy who was both privileged and pressured, raised in a world where expectations were as heavy as the gold trim on his waistcoat. You follow him out into the palace garden now, where the grass is neatly trimmed and the air smells faintly of roses. He's running with his siblings, the clatter of their shoes on the gravel path, mingling with peals of laughter. For a moment, they are just children, tumbling in a heap, their nursemaids wringing their hands and trying to restore order. The sun is warm, the sky is bright, and you get a fleeting sense that this might be one of Frederick's happiest memories. Then the scene shifts again. He's older now, perhaps 9 or 10, sitting at a desk piled high with books. The handwriting lessons have given way to military studies, maps, histories of past battles, geometry for learning artillery calculations. His tutor taps the page impatiently, urging him to focus, and you see the first hints of the discipline that will mark his later life. There's something determined in the way he grips the quill, as though he knows that the only way to make his own mark on the world is to be very, very good at whatever task is put in front of him. When you step back from the picture, you notice how much of his early life was about control of movement, of behavior, of destiny. That control would shape the man he became, the commander who demanded order in the camp, and drilled his soldiers until their boots struck the ground in perfect unison. You realize that the story of marching up and down a hill begins here, in the royal nursery, where a boy learned that life was about following the right path, even if it meant retracing your steps 1,000 times. But there's a shadow here too, one you can sense in the hush that falls over the room when King George III enters. The king was a devoted father, yes, but also a demanding one, and he carried his own struggles with mental health that would one day rock the monarchy. You can almost feel the tension in the air, the way the children straighten their backs and hold their breath when their father's mood is uncertain. Those moments must have left a mark on Frederick, teaching him that order was precious and chaos something to be feared. You leave the palace with a better sense of who he was before the uniform, before the campaigns, before the rhyme made him immortal. He was a child caught between duty and desire, trained to be a soldier before he was even a man, shaped by a family that loved him but expected greatness in return. The sun is setting now over London, the palace windows glowing like embers, and somewhere inside the young prince is finishing his lessons, ready to take his next step toward the destiny waiting for him on foreign fields. You can almost hear the echo of boots again, only now they are smaller, lighter, the footsteps of a boy walking into the future, unaware that one day children will sing about him, turning his life into a rhyme that makes people smile even as it hides the weight he carried. The march resumes, but this time it is not across a muddy Flemish field. It is into the corridors of power, where polished boots echo against marble floors and the air smells faintly of ink, sealing wax, and ambition. You are no longer looking at the boy prince with a wooden sword but at a man in full scarlet uniform, gold braid catching the light as he strides down a hall lined with portraits of past commanders. His promotion had been rapid, almost dizzyingly so, and as you follow his boots' rhythm, you sense the unease that promotion stirred in others. Prince Frederick, now Duke of York, had been made a colonel by age 17, a general by his early 20s, and soon after, commander-in-chief of the entire British Army. To the ordinary soldier, this was either inspiring a royal who will look out for us, or infuriating, another pampered noble skipping the line. You can feel the tension whenever he appears on parade ground. The straight-backed salutes, tinged with just enough side-eye to be noticeable. This wasn't merely an issue of rank. It was about fairness, about whether birth could outweigh merit. The mainstream record shows that Frederick took his role seriously. He wasn't content to be a decorative mascot. He inspected troops, reviewed training, and tried to modernize an army that was, frankly, a patchwork mess after decades of colonial campaigning. The British Army of the late 18th century was riddled with problems. Officers buying commissions rather than earning them. Supply chains breaking down at the worst possible times. Desertion rates so high they might as well have posted revolving doors at the barracks. Frederick wanted to fix that. And yet, ironically, his own rise through the ranks was seen as the ultimate example of favoritism. That was the paradox. The man most associated with reform was also the poster child for privilege. Imagine standing in a coffee house, the hub of gossip and political debate, hearing pamphleteers grumble about how a teenager had been made a colonel when veteran officers were still waiting for promotion. The ink-stained fingers of those pamphleteers turn the pages toward you, and you see the biting cartoons of the era, caricatures of Frederick as a baby clutching a musket, or as a dandy general sipping wine while others fight. The quirky detail here is that some of these satirical prints were surprisingly affectionate. Londoners loved a good lampoon, and the Duke's personality solid, somewhat earnest, not especially scandalous, yet made him an easy but not hated target. He became a kind of running joke, the way people today might meme a celebrity politician for being too posh. You can almost hear the chuckle in the engraver's studio as he sketches Frederick's nose a bit too long, his epaulets comically oversized. Still, beneath the humor, there were real stakes. Every decision Frederick made was scrutinized in Parliament, debated in newspapers, and gossiped about in drawing rooms. Historians still debate whether these early attacks strengthened him, toughened his skin, sharpened his resolve, or whether they planted seeds of hesitation that would haunt his later campaigns. After all, when every order might be turned into tomorrow's headline, you start thinking twice before taking bold action, and yet, action had to be taken. Britain was heading toward war with revolutionary France, a conflict that would consume Europe for more than 2 decades. Frederick's job was to turn the British army from a scattered colonial force into a proper European power again. You picture him bent over a table, candlelight flickering on his face, as he drafts orders to reorganize regiments, standardize training manuals, and enforce stricter discipline. It is at this moment that a certain kind of scandal creeps in, not the lurid, tabloid variety, but the bureaucratic kind. Some officers resented the reforms, especially when Frederick tried to curb the practice of selling commissions. After all, if you'd just spent a fortune buying your rank, you didn't want a royal general telling you that the rules had changed. Letters flew back and forth, and more than one influential nobleman quietly began working to undermine him at court. You can practically smell the candle smoke in those midnight writing sessions, the scratch of quills recording both loyalty and treachery. This is where you see Frederick's character come into focus. He was no tyrant, but he could be stubborn. He pushed reforms through even when they made him unpopular, determined to create an army that wouldn't fall apart in the first major European engagement. You can imagine the grumbles in the officers' mess. The Duke wants another round of inspections? Tell him to inspect the mud, we have plenty of it. And just as the reforms began to take hold, Frederick's personal life gave the pamphleteers something juicier to chew on. Rumors swirled of affairs, of flirtations with actresses, of debts mounting from gambling at fashionable clubs. You're walking through St. James's Street now, past those clubs with their big bow windows, where gentlemen sip port and pretend not to be eavesdropping on the latest scandal. Someone whispers about a certain lady's name being linked to the Duke's. Someone else mutters that a bill went unpaid. It's all very polite, very hushed, but devastating when it hits the papers. The newspapers of the era loved to imply far more than they actually stated. They printed coy little verses about a certain royal general whose attentions had caused a stir, letting readers fill in the blanks. The effect was devastating. A reputation carefully built on discipline and order now stained with the suggestion of impropriety. You feel the sting of it on his behalf, because however true or false the rumors were, they stuck. Even so, Frederick pressed on. He attended reviews, inspected barracks, and continued preparing the army for war. He may have been mocked, but he was not cowed. And there's something admirable about that, the ability to keep marching, metaphorically and literally, even when the crowd is jeering from the roadside. By now, the tension in the air is thick. You can sense that something big is coming, a test that will either justify Frederick's reforms or ruin him completely. The troops are ready, or as ready as they can be, and the politicians in London are sharpening their quills, ready to record triumph or disaster. You can almost hear the distant drums of the coming campaign. You leave the echoing halls behind and step back into the parade ground, where lines of red-coated soldiers stand waiting in the pale morning light. Their muskets glint, their boots shine, and their faces are set with the grim determination of men who know they are about to be sent far from home. Frederick rides out to meet them, his horse's breath steaming in the chill air, and for a moment the scandal sheets are forgotten. This is his moment, his chance to prove that he is more than a nursery rhyme waiting to happen. But as you watch him raise his hand to give the order, you can't help wondering whether history is already sharpening its quill, ready to turn whatever happens next into something that will echo for centuries, a tale of triumph. Or perhaps, as the rhyme suggests, of marching up and down, to no Ava. Ill. The smell of campfire smoke and damp canvas fades, and you find yourself stepping off a barge into the gray chill of Flanders in the 1,790 seconds. The air tastes of salt and wet earth, heavy with the promise of rain that never seems to stop falling in this corner of Europe. Ahead of you, the British army is forming up, lines of red coats bright against the flat, featureless landscape. Somewhere behind you, Wagons creak under the weight of supplies that will never quite arrive where they are supposed to. The Duke of York has brought his men here to fight revolutionary France, and you are about to see why his name would be tied to both reform and ridicule. Imagine slogging through mud that sucks at your boots until you feel as though you are trying to wade through porridge. The soldiers do just that, day after day, and you can hear their complaints in the air as clearly as the crows overhead. This was Britain's first real attempt to throw its weight into the war on the continent, to stand with Austria and the Dutch against the French. Frederick was given command of the expeditionary force, a responsibility that would have terrified a lesser man. He was no Napoleon, not yet anyway. Napoleon was still just a rising artillery officer, but Frederick was determined to prove that Britain could do more than just blockade ports and fight sea battles. The mainstream history is straightforward enough. The Flanders campaign was a disaster. Bad weather, bad planning, and bad coordination with allies combined to create an endless series of retreats and advances. Like a tragic dance performed in slow motion. You can picture it clearly now. The army marches forward under orders, takes a position, digs in, and then, just as they are beginning to feel secure, news arrives that the French have outflanked them, or that the Austrians have fallen back, or that supply lines have failed, and so the men are ordered to retreat, to march back across the same cold, wet ground they just covered. This is where the rhyme begins to feel eerily literal. Up the hill, down the hill, forward, backward, endlessly. The soldiers start to mutter jokes about it, singing little songs under their breath as they trudge through the muck. You can almost hear the rhythm of it, a grim chorus, keeping time with their steps. The Duke, meanwhile, sits his horse with a face that grows grimmer every day, aware that every step backward is another nail in the coffin of his reputation back in London. The quirky detail that sticks with you is the way locals viewed this strange British army that kept appearing and disappearing like a red-coated mirage. Some Flemish villagers reportedly began referring to the soldiers as Les Anglais sauterelles, English grasshoppers, because they seemed to hop from place to place, consuming resources and then vanishing again. You picture yourself sitting in a smoky tavern with those villagers, watching them shrug and pour another mug of ale as news comes that the English have marched through yet again. The cost was not just reputational, it was human. Disease took a heavier toll than enemy fire. Typhus, dysentery, and simple exposure to the cold killed men by the hundreds. You pass rows of makeshift graves, wooden crosses hastily erected in sodden earth. The smell is thick and metallic, a reminder that this was no game of toy soldiers. Letters from the front describe frostbitten toes, rations of hard biscuit crawling with weevils, and the kind of hunger that makes men steal turnips from fields just to stay alive. Historians still debate whether Frederick was personally at fault for the campaign's failure. Some argue that he was hamstrung by poor communication with his Austrian allies and by a government in London that could not or would not supply him adequately. Others say that his cautious approach, his reluctance to press an advantage, squandered opportunities that might have turned the tide. The truth is probably a mixture. He was no military genius, but he was also no fool. You get the sense that he was a man trying to hold a leaky ship together with his bare hands, only to be blamed when the whole thing sank. You can feel the exhaustion now as you march with the troops through rain that seeps into everything. The coats are heavy with water, the muskets slick in the soldiers' hands. There's no romantic glory here, just misery, and the occasional crack of musket fire in the distance, reminding you that the enemy is never far away. At night, the men huddle around small fires, their faces hollow, joking half-heartedly about how many times they will have to climb the next hill before morning. And yet, even in the middle of this bleakness, there are moments of humanity that shine through. Frederick was known to visit the sick, to check on the state of the hospitals, to ensure that his men were not entirely abandoned to suffering. There are reports of him speaking with ordinary soldiers, encouraging them, promising that their hardship was not in vain. You can imagine those conversations. A weary man on horseback, leaning down to listen to a private's complaint, nodding gravely, perhaps even sharing a joke to lighten the mood. It is during one of these moments that you see him not as a caricature but as a commander trying to do right by his men. He was not indifferent to their plight, though that did not stop the papers in London from savaging him. Pamphlets called him indecisive, incompetent, a martinet, who marched men about for no reason. You imagine opening one of those pamphlets in a London coffeehouse, feeling the sting of its satire, even as you know that the man being mocked is out there in the mud, trying to hold an army together. The campaign eventually collapsed entirely, the army forced into a long, bitter retreat back toward the coast. The sound of wagon wheels squealing and horses stumbling fills your ears as you follow them through narrow roads choked with refugees. You can smell the smoke of burning villages, torched to deny shelter to the French. By the time the army reaches the ports and begins to embark for home, they are a shadow of the force that first landed. When you step aboard one of the transports and look back at the low gray coastline, you can feel the weight of failure settle over the men. They have marched up, they have marched down, and now they are marching away entirely. The Duke stands on deck, silent, staring at the horizon. Perhaps he is already thinking of how he will be received back in Britain, cheered by some, jeered by others. Perhaps he knows that this campaign will define him, fair or not, for the rest of his life. As the ship pulls away, the rain eases, and a weak sun breaks through the clouds, glinting off the wet decks. You realize that this is the turning point, the moment when Frederick stops being simply a royal general and becomes a figure of myth. A man whose failures will be immortalized in rhyme, whose name will become shorthand for futility and perseverance all at once. And yet, even as the coastline fades, there is something stubbornly hopeful about the scene. The army is battered, but not broken. Britain will fight again, and so will Frederick. His reforms will continue. His reputation will take more blows. But he will not simply disappear into disgrace. Like the rhyme itself, he will keep marching, up and down, until history is forced to take notice. You step away from the rail and let the wind dry your face. The journey isn't over. In some ways, it is only just beginning. The wind off the Flanders coast fades, and suddenly you're back on solid ground, standing in a drafty barracks somewhere in Kent. The army has returned home, and though the men are alive, their spirits are thinner than the broth in the mess hall. You can hear the shuffle of boots on wooden floors, the clatter of tin mugs, and above it all, a faint hum someone is singing. At first, it sounds like a simple marching tune. But then you catch the words. The grand old Duke of York. He had 10,000 men. And if you never dance, this is the first time you hear the rhyme not as a children's song but as something closer to a protest chant. The soldiers are grinning, not quite daring to laugh out loud in case an officer walks in. But the humor is unmistakable. They have turned their misery into mockery, and the Duke himself is the punchline. You stand among them, feeling the sharp mix of camaraderie and rebellion, and you realize that this is how legends are born, not in official reports, but in the jokes people tell when no one important is listening. The mainstream historical fact is clear. Frederick's Flanders campaign was widely criticized, and his men were among the first to give voice to that criticism. Letters survive from privates and sergeants, written to their families, complaining about being marched back and forth across the same countryside. Some even include little rhymes and sketches mocking the campaign. You imagine those letters being read aloud by candlelight back in Britain, entire villages chuckling at the absurdity of it all. But here in the barracks, the joke feels sharper. You hear a drummer boy exaggerate the march with a comical stomp, causing a ripple of laughter. Another soldier, perhaps emboldened by ale, pantomimes the Duke himself, chin up, chest out, waving an imaginary sword, and ordering everyone to march uphill again for no reason. The room erupts, and for a moment you almost expect Frederick to walk in and demand silence. The quirky thing is that Frederick himself reportedly had a sense of humor about these things. There are accounts, half legend, half truth, that suggest he once overheard soldiers singing the rhyme and laughed along rather than punishing them. It's a strange, almost endearing picture. The very man being mocked joining in on the joke. You can picture him leaning in the doorway, arms crossed, a wry smile tugging at his face as he listens to his men lampoon him. Whether this ever actually happened is debatable, but the image sticks with you because it feels so human. Historians still argue whether the rhyme began as barracks room satire or as a popular street song back in London. Some suggest that it was already circulating in civilian culture and simply adopted by soldiers who found it too fitting to ignore. Others insist it was the soldiers' invention, a piece of gallows humor born out of their endless marches. Either way, by the late 1790s, the words were everywhere on the lips of children, in the music halls, and whispered behind the Duke's back at society dinners. You step outside the barracks now, the cold night air hitting your face, and you hear the rhyme being whistled by a sentry on duty. It has become infectious, spreading through the army like a tune you can't get out of your head. You follow the sound through the camp, passing groups of men huddled around fires, singing softly to keep their spirits up. It is not cruel, not really. It is a way of taking control of their experience, of laughing at the misery so that it doesn't crush them entirely. And yet, you can feel how this would gnaw at a commander's pride. No general wants to be remembered for failure, and certainly not in verse. Picture Frederick sitting at his desk, reading dispatches, aware that somewhere outside, the men are laughing at his expense. Perhaps he sighs, perhaps he grinds his teeth, or perhaps he makes a note to redouble his efforts at reform, determined that the next campaign will give them something better to sing about. This is the moment where the Duke's legacy starts to split in two. On one hand, he becomes a figure of ridicule, a punchline that outlives him by centuries. On the other, he begins to take steps that will transform the British Army into a far more professional force, laying the groundwork for the victories of the Napoleonic Wars. You can feel that tension pulling at the narrative ridicule on one side, respect on the other, like two horses trying to drag the same carriage in opposite directions. The camp quiets as the night deepens, the singing fading to a murmur. Somewhere an officer shouts for silence, and the men grumble but obey. You lie down on a rough cot, staring at the rafters, the words of the rhyme still circling in your head. There's something oddly comforting about it, a reminder that even in disaster, humor can survive. It's almost a lullaby now, the steady rhythm of the words lulling you toward sleep. When you wake, it is morning again, and the world feels different. The air smells of new bread and gunpowder polish, and there's a sense of order returning to the camp. Drills are being run, muskets inspected, boots shined. The Duke has ordered new training regimens, new inspections, and new discipline measures. He seems determined not to let mockery define him entirely. You watch as he rides along the line, his face calm, his posture upright, the very picture of military dignity. The soldiers salute, some perhaps hiding smirks, but they salute nonetheless. You get the feeling that respect and mockery can coexist in the same man's reputation, that it is possible for soldiers to laugh at their commander one moment and follow him into battle the next. The sun climbs higher, glinting off bayonets, and you realize that this, too, is part of the Duke's strange immortality. The rhyme might have started as a joke, but it has become a kind of anthem, a way of remembering the shared hardship of those campaigns. You imagine children of soldiers singing it in village greens, not knowing that their fathers' aching feet were the original inspiration. The day winds down, and as evening falls, you hear the rhyme once more, softer this time, almost gentle. It is no longer just a joke, but a memory, a way of binding the past to the present. You can feel it settling into history, becoming something more permanent than even Frederick might have feared. By the time the stars are out, you understand why this section of the story matters so much. This is where Frederick stops being just a historical figure and becomes a legend, not because of what he did, but because of how people remembered it. And as you settle in by the last fire, the words still echo softly. He marched them up to the top of the hill, and accompanied another percent of life for misted. Tomorrow, there will be new scandals, new campaigns, and new reforms. But tonight, there is just the sound of quiet laughter and the strange comfort of a song that makes sense of hardship, turning mud and misery into something you can hum. The laughter of the soldiers fades into a quieter, more refined sound. The clink of crystal glasses, the soft murmur of conversation, the rustle of silk gowns. You're no longer in the barracks but in a glittering London salon, chandeliers blazing overhead, the air thick with a mingled sense of perfume and candle wax. Here is where another chapter of Frederick's story begins, one that has nothing to do with marching up hills, but everything to do with how a man's private life can become public sport. The Duke of York had returned from Flanders to a mix of sympathy and derision, but London society was far too polite to mock him openly at the opera or in the ballroom. Instead, they whispered about his romances. Frederick was, by all accounts, a man who enjoyed female company, though in a way that was less scandalous than some of his contemporaries. You can picture him now, tall and broad-shouldered, bowing over a lady's hand at a card table, speaking in the careful, measured tones of a man who preferred dignity to flirtation. The mainstream record tells us that Frederick married Princess Frederica Charlotte of Prussia in 1791. The marriage was politically sensible. It tied Britain to Prussia, strengthening alliances in Europe, but it was not a happy one. You watch the couple standing side by side at a royal reception, polite smiles plastered on their faces, while the air between them feels cold enough to frost the punch glasses. They were reportedly ill-suited, with little in common beyond duty, and they soon lived mostly apart. The Duke spent much of his time in London, or at the army headquarters, while Frederica retreated to Oatlands Park, where she kept an eccentric menagerie of dogs and exotic animals. It is here, in the space between duty and desire, that the rumors begin. Society columnists of the time were the forerunners of today's celebrity bloggers, and they delighted in hinting that the Duke's evenings were spent in the company of women who were not his wife. You can almost hear the tittering as you pass a group of powdered ladies fanning themselves in the corner, whispering about a certain actress who might have caught the Duke's eye. The details were vague, always just suggestive enough to stir curiosity without sparking outright scandal. The quirky thing is that the Duke's romantic entanglements were usually painted as more gentlemanly than salacious. Unlike his brother, the Prince of Wales, later George IV, Frederick was not notorious for wild parties or extravagant mistresses. Instead, his liaisons were described as sincere, even affectionate, and sometimes carried on with a degree of domesticity that made them almost respectable in the eyes of some contemporaries. There's a certain picture you get of him, sitting quietly in a well-furnished drawing room, listening to music, perhaps sharing a glass of wine with a companion, rather than cavorting at a riotous masquerade. Historians still disagree about how much of this picture is accurate. Some argue that Frederick's reputation as a sober, dependable man was carefully cultivated to contrast with his more flamboyant brother, a bit of royal image management meant to reassure Parliament that at least one son of the king was trustworthy. Others think Frederick really was the quieter, steadier sibling, and that his few affairs were the result of a man trying to find companionship in a lonely, duty-bound life. Whatever the truth, it was enough to keep London talking. You step into a different scene now, a card room hazy with cigar smoke, where officers and politicians gather to play whist and trade gossip. The Duke is there, his coat immaculate, his manner reserved, but the conversation turns sly as someone makes a joke about his admirers. Laughter follows, not cruel but knowing, and you can feel Frederick's jaw tighten just slightly before he lets out a chuckle of his own. He knew better than to look offended. That would only give the gossips more ammunition. And then there was Mary Anne Clark, the woman whose name would one day be tied most famously to Frederick's downfall. She does not enter the story yet, not fully, but you sense her presence waiting in the wings like an actress about to make her entrance. For now, the rumors are just that shadows cast by candlelight, hints of scandal that never quite solidify into accusation. Even outside the drawing rooms, London was buzzing. Satirical prints began to mix Frederick's military failures with his supposed romantic exploits, drawing him as a bumbling general who could at least charm the ladies. You pause before one such cartoon in a shop window. Frederick astride a horse, doffing his hat to a line of swooning women, while his soldiers trudge behind him carrying mud-caked boots. The public seemed to enjoy the idea of their Duke being more human, more fallible. You stroll along the Strand now, the gas lamps glowing, the city alive with coaches rattling past. Somewhere nearby a theater crowd is spilling out into the street, and you imagine that some of those playgoers are humming the Duke of York rhyme under their breath, perhaps inserting a new verse or two about his love life. The idea of him as a man who marched troops pointlessly and fell in love too easily was simply too good a target for the wits to resist. And yet, even as you listen to the gossip, you can feel that this part of the Duke's story is tinged with melancholy. He had duty without much happiness, rank without much freedom, and his attempts at companionship were judged more harshly than those of other men of his station. There's a quiet dignity in the way he carries himself through this storm, nodding politely, continuing his work, refusing to let whispers knock him off course. You leave the glittering London night and find yourself once more on a quiet road leading toward army headquarters. The torches burn low, the sky above you clear and starry. Somewhere ahead, Frederick is preparing for another day of military administration, another round of reforms, another set of decisions that will shape the army's future. The gossip may swirl endlessly, but the Duke keeps marching forward, this time not up a hill, but into the next challenge that will test both his career and his character. As the night wind brushes your face, you realize that the rhyme children sing today hides all of this. The awkward marriage, the whispered liaisons, the private loneliness. The Duke of York of popular memory is a man who just moves soldiers around for no reason. But the Duke of York of reality was a man who kept trying to balance the demands of love, duty, and honor, even when the entire world seemed ready to laugh at him. The lamps in the distance flicker, and you hear once again the faint chorus of the rhyme, softened now, almost tender. He marched them up to the top of the hill. And somewhere, in some London drawing room, another rumor is being born. The glow of London's gas lamps fades, and you are standing beneath the soaring stone towers of York Minster on a misty February night. The air is crisp, the kind of cold that bites your nose, and the massive Gothic cathedral looms over the city like something out of a medieval dream. Its bells have just tolled midnight, but the square is far from quiet. There is shouting, the sound of running feet, and then, horrifyingly, the crackle of fire. In a flash, the stillness is broken. Flames leap from the roof of the minster, licking at the sky like angry orange fingers. Sparks rain down into the darkness, and smoke billows until it swallows the stars. You can smell the acrid tang of burning timber, feel the heat against your face as townsfolk rush to form a bucket line, their silhouettes thrown into sharp relief by the fire's glow. York Minster is burning, and the whole city has turned out to try to save it. The historical record is clear. The fire of 1829 destroyed the choir of the minster, leaving the great cathedral blackened and scarred. But this isn't just a story about fire, it's a story about blame. As the flames roar, you hear voices in the crowd muttering the same name, the Duke of York. Not because he struck the match, but because the man accused of arson claimed he had done it in protest of the Duke's conduct. Jonathan Martin was his name, a religious zealot with a history of mental illness, and he believed that the cathedral had become corrupt, a place of moral decay. His confession stunned England. He said he set the fire partly because he despised the Duke of York, who, in Martin's view, had disgraced the army and the nation. The connection between the Duke and the fire was thin, but it was enough to light up the press. You can almost hear the scratching of quills as newspaper men in London get to work, their headlines ready to shout, "Arsonist names Duke of York." You move through the smoke-choked nave as firefighters struggle to control the blaze. The air is filled with choking ash. The stained glass windows glow like molten jewels, and the timbers groan as if the entire structure is weeping. The crowd outside is murmuring prayers, some calling this God's judgment, others calling it madness. And somewhere, far away in London, Frederick must have been reading the news with sinking heart, realizing that yet again his name had been dragged into public scandal through no fault of his own. The quirky detail is that Jonathan Martin's trial became something of a spectacle. Crowds packed the courtroom, eager to see the man who had dared to attack one of England's greatest churches. You slip into the gallery now, the room buzzing like a theater before curtain rise. There's Martin in the dock, wild-eyed but strangely calm, declaring that he was on a mission from God. The lawyers argue, the judge listens gravely, and the jury eventually finds him guilty but insane, sparing him the death penalty. Historians still debate whether Martin truly meant to connect the fire to the Duke's reputation, or whether that part of his confession was simply the ravings of a troubled mind. Some suggest that the link was exaggerated by the press, who knew that including a royal name would sell more papers. Others argue that Martin really was motivated by a deep hatred for the Duke's alleged moral failings. Rumors of gambling debts and mistresses still hung over him at the time. You leave the courtroom and step back into the smoking ruin of the minster. It is morning now, and the fire has burned itself out, leaving the great church hollowed and grim. The smell of wet ash clings to everything, and you can see charred beams jutting like broken ribs. Yet even here, there is resilience. Workmen are already hauling away debris, townspeople vowing to rebuild. York Minster will rise again, just as the Duke's public life will continue despite the scandal. And Frederick himself? You picture him reading the papers over breakfast, perhaps grimacing at the headlines but shrugging them off. He was used to it by now, the endless cycle of gossip, accusation, and slow rehabilitation. His task remained the same: keep reforming the army, keep showing up to do the work, keep marching uphill even when the world seemed determined to drag him down. It's this combination of public disaster and private perseverance that makes this part of his story so compelling. The Minster fire became a metaphor in the popular imagination, a symbol of both destruction and redemption, and it tied Frederick, however unfairly, to one of the most dramatic events of the era. As you leave the smoking cathedral grounds, the bells, somehow still standing, begin to toll again, this time not in alarm but in mourning. The sound is low, resonant, and strangely comforting, a reminder that even great disasters become part of the slow rhythm of history. The Duke of York's reputation has been singed, but like the minster, it is not entirely consumed. You follow the sound of the bells out into the quiet streets of York, where dawn is breaking, and the air is finally clear. The people are already sweeping up ashes, righting fallen statues, and planning for the future. There is something stubbornly hopeful in their faces, the same kind of determination you've seen before in Frederick himself. And just as the cathedral will one day be fully restored, the Duke will continue to rebuild his own place in the public eye. There will be more scandals, more songs, more whispers, but also more reforms, more acts of service, more moments where he surprises both his critics and his supporters. By the time you leave the city, the sun is shining on the blackened stones, making them glow gold as though blessed. You realize that this fire, destructive as it was, will make York Minster stronger when it is rebuilt. Perhaps Frederick, too, will emerge from this chapter stronger, his character tempered like iron in a forge. The road ahead is long, and somewhere further down it waits the next duel, this time not of armies, but of reputations, fought in courtrooms and newspapers. But for now, the smoke clears, and you can breathe again. The smell of smoke from York Minster lingers in your memory as the scene shifts, pulling you toward London once more. You find yourself in a narrow Georgian street at dawn, mist curling around the cobblestones like pale fingers. The air is tense, unnaturally quiet, too quiet. Then you see them, two men, cloaks thrown back, pistols in hand, standing apart at a measured distance. This is not the battlefield, but the dueling ground. Dueling was still part of aristocratic life in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, a grim way of defending one's honor when words failed. Tonight, though, the man at the center of it all is not the Duke himself, but one of his friends, another officer whose name has been dragged into gossip that ties back to Frederick. You watch as the seconds measure out the paces, the morning light just beginning to turn the fog to gold. The mainstream record shows that the Duke of York was frequently caught in the middle of quarrels, both personal and political. He tried to be a mediator, urging hot-headed young officers to sheath their swords and keep their tempers in check. But this was a culture where honor mattered more than life, and sometimes duels could not be stopped. You can almost hear Frederick's exasperated voice, calm but firm, insisting that no slight was worth a death. But he knew well that no amount of persuasion could always prevent a man from walking onto the field. What's fascinating is that Frederick himself was rumored to have fought at least one duel in his youth, though the accounts are vague. Some say it was over a card table dispute, others that it involved a veiled insult toward the royal family. Whether it happened or not, you can picture it vividly. Frederick, younger and slimmer, standing at the ready, heart pounding, the early morning dew clinging to his boots. And perhaps he fires into the air, choosing honor without bloodshed, because even his critics admitted that he was no reckless killer. The quirky detail here is how dueling culture intersected with politics. Parliament might be debating military reform one day, and the next day 2 MPs could be on the field at dawn, pistols loaded, while their colleagues took breakfast. The newspapers ate it up, printing dramatic descriptions of shots exchanged and satisfaction obtained. For someone like Frederick, who was constantly under public scrutiny, this was a minefield. If he tried to stop a duel, he could be accused of cowardice or interfering in gentlemen's affairs. If he allowed one to proceed, he risked bloodshed that might stain his reputation. Historians still debate whether Frederick's attempts to reduce dueling within the army were truly effective. Some argue that his push for stricter discipline and formal channels for resolving disputes helped reduce the culture of violence among officers. Others insist that dueling only declined much later, when society as a whole grew tired of seeing promising young men killed over trifles. But there is no question that Frederick was caught between tradition and reform, trying to steer the army toward a more professional future without alienating the officer class who clung to their code of honor. You leave the dueling ground and step into a different kind of battlefield, the House of Commons. Here the air hums with debate, the chamber crowded with wigs and powdered faces, and you can almost feel the tension radiating from the benches. A member rises to speak, his voice sharp, accusing the Duke of York of mishandling funds or showing favoritism in promotions. The words cut like blades, and you can see Frederick's allies bristle, leaping to his defense. This, too, is a duel one fought with rhetoric instead of pistols, but no less dangerous to a man standing. The Duke himself, when present, would sit with the calm reserve of someone who knew that any sign of temper could be used against him. You imagine him listening carefully, fingers steepled, before replying with measured dignity. There was steel in him, even if it did not always flash. And then there were the scandals that were less political and more personal, the gaming debts, the rumored affairs, the occasional whisper of financial entanglements that raised eyebrows. London was a city that thrived on gossip, and the caricaturists sharpened their pens every time Frederick's name appeared in the society columns. You picture a print shop window displaying a new cartoon, the Duke juggling pistols and banknotes, looking harried while soldiers march in circles behind him. The crowd outside chuckles, enjoying the spectacle. But there is also respect here, oddly enough. When Frederick did act decisively, when he cracked down on corruption in the commissariat, or punished officers for misconduct, he earned a reputation as a man who would not let the army slide into chaos. You can feel the grudging admiration of even his enemies when he takes a stand. It's late afternoon now, and you are walking along Rotten Row in Hyde Park, where fashionable London comes to see and be seen. Frederick is there too, riding slowly, acknowledging Bose with a nod. His expression is inscrutable, but you wonder what he is thinking as he passes knots of people who are surely discussing him, debating whether he is a man of honor or a man of scandal. Perhaps he has learned to let the whispers wash over him like rain on a parade ground. As dusk falls, you find yourself once more at the dueling ground, now empty, the grass damp and silent. The fog creeps back in, and you stand there imagining all the men who stood on this spot over the years, some walking away, some carried away. Frederick's story is bound up with theirs, not because he fought many duels, but because he lived in a world where every decision could feel like one, where the stakes were life, death, and honor, even if the weapons were words. The stars prick through the fog, and somewhere in the distance you hear the faint refrain of that old rhyme again, almost like a ghostly chorus. He marched them up to the top of the hill. Perhaps that is what all of this is. You think an endless series of climbs and descents, of reputations built and battered, of scandals fought and forgotten. And as you turn to leave, you know the next chapter will bring Frederick face to face with his greatest trial. Yet not on a battlefield or a dueling ground, but in a courtroom where his integrity itself will be put on trial before the entire nation. The fog of the dueling ground dissolves into candlelit chambers, where polished wood gleams and the air smells faintly of ink, tallow, and earnest debate. You are standing in the House of Lords, on a night when history is about to turn. The Duke of York, tall and solemn, is present for one of the most consequential votes of his life. The benches are crowded, the peers restless, their voices low murmurs under the vaulted ceiling. Everyone knows that tonight they are voting on whether to end Britain's participation in the transatlantic slave trade. It is a strange moment in Frederick's story. You followed him through mud and rumor, through duels and caricatures, but here he stands on moral ground as solid as any hill he ever marched. The mainstream record is clear. Frederick supported the abolition of the slave trade in 1807, a stance that put him on the right side of history and marked one of the most humane decisions of his public career. You can almost hear the rustle of paper as speeches are read aloud, some passionate, some cautious, some downright resistant. Britain's economy was entangled with the trade sugar, tobacco, cotton, and there were powerful voices arguing that ending it would harm the empire. The debate is heated, with peers rising to tell stories of plantations and profits, while others describe the horrors of the Middle Passage in harrowing detail. You stand silently, listening to the clash of rhetoric, feeling the weight of centuries of injustice pressing on the room like a physical presence. Then Frederick rises. His voice is not fiery, he is not Wilberforce, after all, but it is steady, deliberate, and tinged with a gravitas that makes the chamber fall quiet. You imagine him acknowledging the economic arguments, nodding to the fears of disruption, but insisting that morality must take precedence. The British Army, he argues, has fought and bled for the principles of liberty and order. How can the nation continue to profit from human bondage? There is something quietly moving about the scene. Frederick was a man whose reputation had been battered by accusations of incompetence and scandal. Yet here he is, lending his name to a cause that is bigger than himself. It is one of those moments where you glimpse the better side of him, the reformer, who wanted to leave the army, and perhaps the country, stronger and more just than he found it. The quirky thing is that Frederick's vote was not widely celebrated at the time. The newspapers focused on more sensational stories, preferring to lampoon his latest rumored gambling debt or flirtation rather than praise him for taking a moral stand. In some ways, It is almost forgotten now that the Duke of York played a small but meaningful part in one of Britain's great legislative victories. And yet, the record shows he was there, that he spoke, and that he voted for abolition. Historians still discuss whether Frederick's support was driven by genuine conviction or by political calculation. Some argue that he saw which way the wind was blowing, that abolition had strong momentum, and that it was wise for a royal duke to be on the winning side. Others believe he was sincere, pointing to his earlier interest in the welfare of soldiers and his reputation for personally visiting military hospitals. Perhaps he simply believed that cruelty, whether in a barracks or on a slave ship, had no place in a nation that considered itself civilized. When the vote is finally taken, the chamber is tense. You hold your breath along with everyone else as the clerks count the numbers. And then it is done. The motion passes. The transatlantic slave trade is to be abolished. The room exhales, some peers nodding gravely, others muttering about economic ruin, but the decision stands. Britain will no longer traffic in human lives. You follow Frederick out of the chamber into the cool night air. London is hushed, the streets glistening with recent rain. Somewhere in the distance, you hear church bells ringing, as if the city itself is acknowledging the moment. Frederick pauses on the steps, perhaps thinking of the countless lives that will be spared the nightmare of the Middle Passage. Or perhaps he is thinking of the political battles still ahead, knowing that this vote was only the beginning. The world does not change overnight. The trade may be banned, but slavery itself still exists in Britain's colonies, and it will take another generation to end it entirely. Yet tonight feels like a turning point, a march that finally led somewhere rather than circling back to the starting point. You walk beside Frederick as he returns to his quarters. The lamps cast long shadows on the pavement, and the city feels oddly peaceful. For once, the gossip and caricatures seem far away. No one is singing the nursery rhyme tonight. No one is mocking him. He has played a part, however modest, in something monumental. And there is another layer to this moment. In voting for abolition, Frederick was also shaping the character of the army he commanded. Britain's soldiers would now fight not just to defend colonies but, eventually, to suppress the illegal trade and to free those enslaved on enemy ships. It was a step toward the idea of Britain as a force for humanitarian intervention, a concept that would echo through the 19th century. As the night deepens, you find yourself reflecting on how strange and complex this man's legacy is. Here is someone who could be mocked as a bungler one moment and remembered as a reformer the next. He could march men up a hill for no clear reason, and then turn around and cast a vote that would change the moral trajectory of an empire. The firelight from a nearby tavern spills onto the street, and you catch a few patrons talking about the day's news. One of them, a radical in a threadbare coat, raises his glass and toasts the vote, saying that perhaps now Britain has taken a step toward being truly free. Another mutters that it will ruin the sugar trade, but even he sounds resigned. The tide has turned. By the time you reach Frederick's residence, the city is quiet again. Inside, the Duke removes his sword belt, lays aside his coat, and sits heavily in a chair. Perhaps he allows himself a small, private smile, the kind that no newspaper cartoonist will ever capture. For all the hills he has climbed, this one finally feels worth it. The candles burn low, and as you step back out into the night, you sense that tomorrow will bring more marches, political, military, and personal. But tonight, there is the rare feeling that progress has been made, that the world has shifted just a little towards something better. And somewhere, deep in the stillness, you think you hear the rhyme again, softer this time, almost approving. He marched them up to the top of the hill. This time, you think, maybe they stayed there long enough to make a difference. The warm glow of the Lord's chamber fades, and you find yourself stepping into the bustling corridors of Whitehall, where the smell of ink and candle smoke hangs thick, and the air vibrates with murmurs. Word of the abolition vote has spread, but so have the latest reports from the army, and Parliament is restless. You hear the clatter of coach wheels outside, bringing in members eager to debate not morality this time, but competence. Once again, the Duke of York is in the crosshairs. The mainstream historical record shows that Frederick's career as commander-in-chief was a cycle of highs and lows, as regular as the march he was mocked for. He pushed for reforms that standardized training, improved barracks conditions, and professionalized officer appointments. But every time progress was made, some scandal or military setback would drag his name back through the mud. You can almost feel that cycle grinding forward again as you watch MPs file into the chamber, their expressions set, their voices sharpening. Today the debate is about cost, always cost. The army reforms were expensive, and the nation, already drained by years of war, was watching its purse strings closely. You stand near the bar of the House of Commons, feeling the tension radiate off the benches as one member after another stands to accuse the army of waste, of mismanagement, of draining the treasury for no gain. Some do not name the Duke directly, but their meaning is clear. The man in charge must answer. The quirky part is that Frederick was, in many ways, the least extravagant of his royal brothers. He lived well, yes, and he did gamble. He never quite escaped that particular vice. But he was not the flamboyant spender that the Prince of Wales was, nor did he flaunt his wealth the way others at court did. Still, when the public wanted a scapegoat for the army's shortcomings, his name was the one they reached for. You can almost hear the coffeehouse gossip. It's the Duke's fault. He's lining pockets. He's too soft. He's too harsh. He's marching them nowhere. This is a vad apology, and del you good help skriver in a very. To a mother temps of. Historians still disagree on whether Frederick's policies were truly visionary or just tinkering at the edges. Some argue that he laid the foundations for the modern British army, pointing out that the force that beat Napoleon at Waterloo owed much of its discipline to his reforms. Others suggest that his changes were incremental and that he lacked the genius of a great strategist, leaving the army effective but uninspired. What they do agree on is that he was relentless year after year, pushing for better standards, refusing to let the institution stagnate, even when the press vilified him. You leave the Commons and wander down to a print shop, where the latest caricatures are being hung in the window. There he is again, the Duke of York, rendered with a nose slightly too big and epaulets exaggerated, surrounded by bags of gold and soldiers marching in absurd circles. The satire is brutal but funny, and you see Londoners gathered around, laughing as they pass by. You can't help but smile at one print showing the Duke as a kind of human weather vane, pointing one way one day, the opposite direction the next, a clear jab at his reputation for ordering retreats. And then, there are the speeches, in the press pamphleteers calling for his resignation, others rallying to his defense. The debate spills into drawing rooms, dinner tables, and even the alehouses of distant villages. The Duke of York is no longer just a man. He is a symbol of everything people love or hate about the army. You can feel that weight pressing on him like a pack that grows heavier with every step. Inside Horse Guards, Frederick continues to work. You stand at the edge of a long table as he meets with staff officers, poring over ledgers and maps. The candlelight glints off his buttons as he listens to reports, occasionally raising an eyebrow at some outrageous expense claim. Whatever the politicians may think, he is not idle. You can sense his frustration. He is doing the work. He is reforming the system. And yet, the public sees only the setbacks. One of his greatest challenges was the purchase system for commissions. It had been the way of things for centuries. Young men bought their way into officer ranks, and money rather than merit determined advancement. Frederick tried to reform this practice, to require competency exams and prevent the worst abuses. But every time he pushed, he met resistance from powerful families who wanted to secure commissions for their sons. You imagine the private conversations at clubs and salons, where aristocrats mutter that the Duke is threatening tradition. It is here you see his stubbornness as both a virtue and a liability. He does not back down easily, but every fight costs him political capital. When scandals break like those involving contracts for army supplies or favoritism in promotions, his enemies seize the chance to say, "See, the Duke is part of the problem." Even if he had no direct involvement, the mud sticks. As night falls, you step out into street, James's Park, where the gas lamps flicker and the sound of carriage wheels rattles on the mall. Frederick is somewhere nearby, perhaps at Carlton House in conference with his brother, perhaps at home nursing a headache. You imagine him reading the latest pamphlet, grimacing at the accusations but refusing to resign. He had resigned once before under pressure, only to be reinstated later when the army faltered without him. This time, he is determined to weather the storm. The moon rises, silvering the park, and you find yourself thinking about how lonely it must have been to carry that much public scrutiny, to be a figure people laughed at and respected. Sometimes in the same breath, the rhyme about marching up and down the hill becomes almost symbolic of his entire life. Progress, setback, progress again. A cycle that never quite ends. And yet, you sense that there is resilience here. Each time he falls, he climbs back up. Each time scandal breaks, he digs in and continues his work. He is not a perfect man, his flaws are obvious, but he is not a quitter. By the time dawn breaks over Whitehall, the city is waking up again, ready for the next day's debates, the next round of satire, the next uphill march. You stand on the steps of Horse Guards and watch as clerks hurry in, officers stride past, and the machinery of empire creaks back to life. Somewhere inside, Frederick is already at his desk, pen in hand, planning the next reform, the next inspection, the next attempt to make the army stronger than the scandal that surrounds it. The bells of St. Martin in the Fields chime the hour, and you feel the familiar rhythm returning forward, back, forward again, just like the rhyme. The political fallout has not broken him. If anything, it has made him more determined to prove that the man who marched 10,000 men up a hill can still lead them somewhere worth going. The bells of St. Martin in the Fields fade as you are drawn into another chamber, this one close and tense, smelling of chalk, dust, ink, and the sweat of too many bodies packed together. You are in the House of Commons gallery during the infamous Clark affair, one of the most public reckonings of the Duke of York's career. The year is 1809, and the room is buzzing like a hive, the air practically crackling with anticipation. This is not a duel at dawn, nor a battlefield skirmish, but it may prove more dangerous to Frederick's reputation than either. At the center of the storm is Mary Ann Clark, Frederick's former mistress, now seated in the witness box, with a mixture of confidence and theatrical poise. Her eyes sparkle as she scans the room, knowing that every whisper, every rustle of paper is about her. She is about to give testimony that will grip the nation. The mainstream historical record tells us that Clark accused the Duke of allowing her to sell army commissions, officer appointments, and promotions to those willing to pay, allegedly with his knowledge. The moment feels electric. You can hear the scratch of quills as clerks and journalists record every word. Members of Parliament lean forward, some eager to see the Duke humbled, others grim with loyalty, ready to defend him. Clark speaks clearly, her voice carrying through the chamber. She describes letters, conversations, payments. Each detail lands like a musket shot. The crowd outside, gathered in the streets, will soon be shouting about this scandal. You glance toward the benches where Frederick sits, his expression calm but taut, the set of his jaw betraying tension. This is not a man unused to public criticism, but this accusation cuts close. It is not about battlefield blunders or caricatures in print. This is about integrity, about whether the man entrusted with reforming the army has betrayed it instead. The quirky part is how much of this played out like theater. The hearings lasted weeks, with Clark offering witty replies and sly remarks that made her an unlikely celebrity. London society was obsessed. People sold tickets to get into the gallery, and pamphlets printed her testimony in full for those who could not attend. You can almost hear the street hawkers crying, "The Clark scandal, full account," as you walk down Fleet Street. Historians still debate whether Clark was telling the truth. Some believe she was acting out of revenge after her relationship with the Duke ended, embellishing her story to damage him. Others think she may have been encouraged by political enemies who wanted to weaken the government by toppling one of its key figures. There were letters, some genuine, some disputed, that hinted at her influence over Frederick. But whether he explicitly approved the sale of commissions has never been definitively proven. Back inside the chamber, the debate rages. MPs rise to denounce corruption, to defend the honor of the army, to demand reforms. Others rise, just as passionately, to insist that the evidence is flimsy, that the Duke is being unfairly maligned. You sit, barely breathing, as the hours stretch into evening and the candles burn low. At last, the vote is called. The House divides, the members filing into their lobbies, the sound of their footsteps echoing like distant drums. When they return, the result is announced. The Duke is cleared of personal corruption by a narrow margin. He is not guilty, but the damage is done. The public has heard every word of the testimony, and in the court of public opinion, acquittal does not erase suspicion. Frederick resigns as commander-in-chief, a decision that feels heavy but inevitable. You see him step down from his post with dignity, offering no angry outburst, no self-pity. He is a man who knows that even if he has survived the official verdict, he must remove himself from the storm before it engulfs the entire army. The streets outside are buzzing with reaction. Some cheer, believing justice has been done. Others jeer, shouting that the Duke should have been punished more severely. Caricaturists get to work immediately, their latest prints showing Clark leading Frederick around by the nose, or the Duke trying to hide behind a stack of commissions. The jokes are sharp, but they are everywhere, pasted to walls and sold on street corners. You follow Frederick as he retreats from public life for a time, traveling quietly, perhaps reflecting on how quickly reputation can turn. Imagine him sitting by a window at Oatlands or another estate, staring out over the park, weighing whether he will ever return to command. But the army is still there, still in need of direction. Without his steady hand, cracks begin to show. Reports reach London of disciplinary issues, of supply problems, of inefficiency creeping back in. You sense Parliament shifting uneasily, realizing that removing Frederick has left a gap no one else seems quite able to fill. It is during this period that you see the resilience that has always defined him. The Duke is not done. Slowly, steadily, his allies begin to call for his return. Public opinion, so fickle, begins to soften. The soldiers themselves, those same men who once mocked him, remember that under his watch, conditions improved and reforms were pushed through. Letters circulate praising his efforts, and eventually, the government invites him back. You are there on the day he resumes his post, stepping once more into Horse Guards with measured dignity. There is no fanfare, no grand speech, just a man returning to the work he believes in. He will never entirely shake the stain of the Clark affair, but he will not let it define the end of his career either. As evening falls, you stand again in the Commons chamber, now quiet, the benches empty. The echoes of those debates still seem to hang in the air. This was one of Frederick's hardest climbs, and though he reached the top again, he bears the scars of the descent. Outside, London hums with life, oblivious to the weight of the day's history. Somewhere in the distance, children sing the rhyme once more, their voices bright and thoughtless. He marched them up to the top of the hill. You smile faintly, perhaps, in a strange way. That is exactly what he has done, marched himself up, been brought down, and climbed again, still standing even after the firestorm of the courtroom. The next hill, you know, will test him in different ways, because the battles ahead will not just be about politics, but about loyalty to crown, to country, and to himself. The echoes of the courtroom fade, and you find yourself walking through the quiet corridors of Windsor Castle, where the air feels heavy with candle smoke and something darker uncertainty, perhaps even fear. The year is later now, and King George III's mental health has once again taken a turn. You hear the distant sound of a harpsichord playing somewhere in the castle, its melody slow and wistful, and you realize that this is not just a royal residence tonight but a place under strain. Frederick, the Duke of York, walks these halls with measured steps, his boots clicking against the stone. He is no longer the young general eager to prove himself, nor the scandal-shadowed commander forced to resign. He is older now, heavier perhaps, but his bearing is still military straight, and yet his face shows the burden of something more personal than military defeat. This is the pain of a son watching his father slip in and out of lucidity. The mainstream history of George III's illness is well known. Bouts of mental instability that grew worse over time. Periods when he could not rule, and Parliament had to appoint a regent. You can feel the tension as you pass a pair of servants whispering in a corner, their eyes darting toward the king's apartments. There is always a sense of dread here during these episodes. What will the king say tonight? Will he be coherent, or lost in a torrent of confused speech? Frederick's relationship with his father had always been complex. As a boy he had been drilled hard, expected to excel, and the memory of that stern upbringing must have mixed now with pity, grief, and a sense of helplessness. You can almost see him standing by the doorway of the king's chamber, listening to his father speak in a stream of disconnected thoughts, feeling a pang of sorrow that even a soldier's discipline cannot conceal. This is where the Duke's loyalty is tested, in ways the parade ground never prepared him for. His elder brother, the Prince of Wales, has been named regent, effectively ruling in their father's place. The brothers have never been especially close, their temperaments different, George flamboyant and pleasure-loving, Frederick steady and duty-bound, but now Frederick must work with him, support him, and yet sometimes oppose him, depending on what is best for the army and the crown. The quirky detail is that Frederick's sense of duty often put him in the awkward position of disagreeing with the regent's political allies. While the Prince of Wales leaned toward the Whigs, Frederick's military role often aligned him with government policy, meaning that he sometimes found himself caught between loyalty to family and loyalty to the institutions he served. You picture him sitting late at night at his desk, pen in hand, writing letters that try to thread the needle firm but respectful, defending army priorities without openly defying the regent. Historians still argue whether Frederick's relationship with the regent softened during this period or grew more strained. Some say that shared responsibility brought them closer, that Frederick became a quiet advisor who lent stability to the regency. Others argue that the brothers never fully trusted one another, that Frederick remained wary of George's indulgent lifestyle and political gamesmanship. Whatever the truth, you can sense that the Duke's position was precarious. Too much loyalty to the regent might look like opportunism. Too much independence might look like disloyalty. You follow Frederick out into the castle gardens under a cold moon, where he walks alone, hands clasped behind his back. The night is still, but inside his mind you can almost hear the storm memories of campaigns, of scandals, of courtroom accusations, and now this private grief for a father whose mind is no longer whole. You realize that for all his public role, Frederick's life has been shaped as much by family as by politics, by the expectations placed on him as a son, as much as those placed on him as a general. Back in London, the newspapers are still printing caricatures and gossip, but you notice a softer tone creeping into some of the commentary. Perhaps the public, too, senses that this is a man carrying a heavy burden. There is something almost sympathetic in the way some satirical prints now show the Duke, not as a buffoon, but as a tired soldier leaning on his sword. In moments like these, Frederick's reforms take on a different light. His insistence on better conditions for soldiers, his push for professional standards, even his meddling with the purchase system, all of it looks less like vanity and more like an attempt to create order in a world that so often threatened to slip into chaos. The rhyme about marching up and down the hill might mock him, but you start to see it as a metaphor for his life's work, the endless climb to keep the army, and perhaps the monarchy itself, upright. As you walk through the castle's chapel, you pause by the royal pews, the smell of beeswax and stone dust filling your lungs. Here, Frederick must have prayed for his father, for the kingdom, perhaps even for himself. Imagine the mixture of love, frustration, and determination in those prayers. A soldier can fight an enemy, but how does a son fight an illness that steals a father away piece by piece? You leave Windsor as dawn is breaking, the frost crunching under your feet, and you feel the weight of this chapter settle on you. This was not a battle won or lost on a field. It was a battle of endurance, of loyalty, of dignity, in the face of something no musket or saber could stop. And when you reach London again, you find Frederick already back at work, inspecting reports, issuing orders, keeping the machine turning. His father may falter, but he will not. The army marches on, and so does the Duke, still climbing hills, still refusing to stay down no matter how many times fate sends him back to the bottom. Somewhere in the city, the rhyme is sung again by children in the street, their voices bright in the early light. But this time it sounds less like mockery and more like a kind of stubborn tribute. Up, down, again and again, because that is what life demands. You watch the Duke mount his horse and ride off toward Horse Guards, his figure upright against the pale sky. He is still a son, still a brother, still a commander, and still a man with more battles ahead. The kind that will test his reputation, his resolve, and the loyalty of everyone around him. The dawn light over Windsor fades into a harsher, bleaker glow. You are standing on a wind-swept plain, the ground uneven and pockmarked, the air carrying the faint iron smell of blood long dried. This is not a battlefield in the heat of action, but its aftermath. The wind whistles through abandoned trenches, and in the distance you see rows of freshly dug graves, simple wooden markers leaning in the mud, some with names, many without. This is the cost of command. Frederick, Duke of York, understood it as well as any man who never led a charge himself. The mainstream record tells us that during his tenure as commander-in-chief, the British Army was engaged on multiple fronts: the Peninsular War in Spain, expeditions in the Caribbean, campaigns in the Mediterranean. Soldiers died of wounds, yes, but far more died of disease, fever, dysentery, yellowjack, entire regiments cut down without ever firing a shot. You walk among the graves, hearing the mournful flap of tattered regimental flags. Somewhere nearby, a chaplain's voice drones through a burial service, the words almost swallowed by the wind. The soldiers standing around are gaunt and hollow-eyed, their red coats faded to rust brown by weather and wear. Their boots are crusted with mud, their shoulders stooped, but they stand at attention as the last prayers are spoken. You can almost feel Frederick's presence here, though he is miles away, reading casualty lists by candlelight in horse guards, each name a weight pressing on his conscience. The quirky thing is that Frederick, unlike some commanders of his era, reportedly read those lists with genuine care. Letters from officers describe how he asked for detailed reports on losses, not merely totals. He wanted to know what had gone wrong. Was it bad food? Bad water? Poor medical supply? He had a reputation for visiting hospitals, speaking to the wounded, and ensuring that reforms were made to reduce needless deaths. You imagine him walking slowly between cots, the men trying to sit up despite their pain, surprised to see a royal duke stooping to ask about their rations. Historians still debate whether his reforms were revolutionary or simply overdue, but many agree that he helped professionalize the army's medical service. He supported the creation of better field hospitals, cleaner barracks, and stricter sanitary measures. It was not glamorous work, no poet sang about drainage ditches or quarantine protocols, but it saved lives. And it showed that Frederick's concern for the army went beyond drilling men up and down hills. Yet even with improvements, the losses were staggering. You can see it in the empty space on the muster rolls, in the tear-stained letters sent back to England, in the widows petitioning for pensions outside horse guards. Parliament was quick to point out every failure, every unnecessary death, and opponents used the statistics as weapons, accusing Frederick of squandering Britain's youth in futile campaigns. The public mood was fickle. When victories came, Corunna, Talavera, Salamanca, the Duke was praised for having kept the army ready. But when losses mounted, the rhyme about marching up and down took on a darker edge, as if the nation believed its sons were being wasted in endless, meaningless maneuvers. You step away from the graves now and find yourself at a recruiting station back in Britain. The sergeant is shouting for volunteers, the drum beating a steady rhythm, the crowd watching as boys barely into manhood step forward. Some are lured by the bounty money, others by adventure, still others because there are no jobs at home. The king's shilling changes hands, and you know that some of these boys will never come back. Frederick knew it too, and it is said that he pushed for better pay and conditions partly to make the sacrifice more bearable and perhaps to ease his own conscience. Night falls on the plain, and the burial ground is lit by a few guttering lanterns. You sit on a stump, listening to the wind rattle through the grass, thinking about the strange mixture of compassion and duty that defined Frederick's tenure. He could be stern, he could be stubborn, but he also fought for soldiers' welfare in ways that outlived him. The silence is broken by the faint sound of fifes and drums somewhere. A regiment is on the march again, because war never really waits. You follow the sound to a camp where the men are preparing for another campaign, their faces grim but determined. The Duke is not there physically, but his policies are. The standardized drill that keeps the lines steady, the improved rations that keep the men stronger, the better medical service that may save some of them if they fall ill. You watch them march off into the darkness, the lanterns bobbing like fireflies, and you realize that this, too, is part of the hill marching metaphor. Progress is slow, costly, and sometimes requires going back to start over, but each step builds something that wasn't there before. The quirky thing about memory is that people rarely sing songs about sanitation reform or pension improvements. They remember the hills, the defeats, the jokes. Yet the army Frederick left behind was stronger than the one he inherited, better able to face Napoleon's legions, and ultimately victorious at Waterloo. His reforms meant fewer needless deaths, and that is a legacy worth marching for. Historians still argue whether Frederick should be remembered more as a reformer or as a general who failed in the field. Some say the graves are proof enough of his shortcomings, others that they are simply the cost of war in an age when logistics and medicine were still catching up to ambition. The truth is that Frederick carried those losses with him. Even in portraits painted late in his life, there is something solemn in his eyes, as though he is still counting the men who did not come home. As dawn breaks over the burial ground, you turn away, the grass wet under your boots, and head back toward London. The city will be waking soon, and the newspapers will be filled with casualty figures and parliamentary debates. But here, among the graves, you feel something quieter, a resolve to keep marching, because to stop would mean the deaths meant nothing. And so the story moves forward. The Duke of York, chastened but not broken, will face the public again, defend his choices, and press on with the work of reform. The rhyme may have mocked him, but perhaps it also captured his stubbornness, his refusal to let defeat or death end the march. By the time you reach the edge of the plain, the sun is climbing, casting long shadows from the wooden crosses. It feels almost like a salute. You pause for a moment, then keep walking. The next hill is waiting. The sunlit burial ground dissolves, and suddenly, you are back in bustling London, where the streets are alive with hawkers shouting, carriage wheels rattling, and children running along the cobblestones, singing that maddeningly catchy rhyme. Only now, it has changed tone. It is no longer an angry chant whispered by soldiers or a bitter jibe muttered in alehouses. It has become something lighter, almost playful. The Duke of York is no longer the villain of public imagination. He is a kind of national punchline, the man you laugh at rather than rage against. The mainstream record shows that after his reinstatement as commander-in-chief, Frederick settled into a role that was less controversial and more enduring. He kept up his reforms, improving training and administration, but the great public scandals had quieted. The worst storms passed, and something curious happened. The British public began to treat him with a kind of grudging fondness. You can almost feel the shift as you pass a print shop window displaying the latest caricature. The Duke is there as always, but this time he is smiling, almost cherubic, as he marches his troops up a hill of sugar loaves, or dances them back down in comic rhythm. The laughter is not cruel anymore, it is affectionate. This is the stage where a man's legacy begins to harden into legend. You walk through Vauxhall Gardens one evening and hear a group of young people singing the rhyme in harmony, laughing as they try to invent new verses. Their mirth isn't biting, it's communal, as though the Duke has become a shared character in Britain's great domestic story, a bit of comic relief in an era otherwise dominated by grim wars and rising bread prices. The quirky detail is that even some of the soldiers began to adopt the joke with pride. Accounts survive of officers writing light-hearted letters, mentioning how they marched up and down like good Yorkists, turning what had once been an insult into a badge of shared experience. You can picture Frederick reading one of these letters and allowing himself a wry smile. By this point, he must have realized that the rhyme was unstoppable, so perhaps the only way to beat it was to let it run its course and become harmless. Historians still debate whether this transformation was deliberate image management or simply the natural result of time dulling the edge of scandal. Some argue that Frederick worked quietly to rehabilitate his public standing by doubling down on his administrative competence, letting results speak louder than accusations. Others think the public simply grew tired of outrage and found it easier to laugh. Whichever it was, you can feel the tension lifting as the years pass, and the nursery rhyme shifts from satire to sing-song tradition. You step into a tavern now, the air thick with pipe smoke, the tables crowded with men drinking to the latest victory against Napoleon's forces in Spain. The talk is loud and celebratory, and when someone proposes a toast to the Duke of York for his part in keeping the army effective, the room erupts in cheers. You realize this is a far cry from the dark muttering during the Flanders retreat. The same man who was once ridiculed for marching troops pointlessly has become a figure people thank, however indirectly, for the army that is now winning battles. The mood is not entirely reverent, of course. Londoners never miss a chance to laugh at authority. You step back outside into the lamplit street and see a group of children chalking little stick figure drawings of the Duke on the pavement, giggling as they draw his soldiers in long wobbly lines. The rhyme is on everyone's lips now, a staple of nursery games, detached from its origins and becoming pure rhythm and nonsense for the next generation. In Horse Guards, meanwhile, Frederick continues to work. You stand behind him as he dictates memoranda, the desk stacked with correspondence. His hair is going gray, his frame broader with age, but his mind is still sharp. He has outlasted many of his critics, and though he is still teased, he is also respected. The army is running more smoothly than it has in decades, and the Duke's steady hand is credited for much of it. There's an irony you can't help but notice. The man mocked as the grand old Duke was, in the end, a builder of systems, someone who turned chaos into order. The rhyme, meant to belittle him, has instead ensured that he is remembered when dozens of other commanders have faded into obscurity. If he had been merely competent, his name might have been forgotten. It is his failures, and the public's decision to laugh at them, that kept him alive in memory. As you wander through Covent Garden, you hear a ballad singer belting out a comic version of the rhyme, the crowd around him clapping and joining in. You catch snippets of lyrics, adding new absurdities, marching them to the moon. to the Thames, to the Tower, each verse sillier than the last. The Duke has become a character as much as a commander, woven into the culture in a way that is strangely enduring. And perhaps Frederick understood this. Perhaps he knew that being remembered as the man who marched them up the hill was better than being forgotten entirely. After all, plenty of men led campaigns in the 18th century whose names are now mere footnotes. The Duke of York, by contrast, has become a kind of immortal folk figure, his image marching through centuries with every nursery rhyme recitation. Historians sometimes call this the comic redemption phase of Frederick's legacy, where the anger fades and the myth takes on a life of its own. You can feel that transition complete as you watch children skipping rope to the rhythm of his name, entirely innocent of the scandals and disasters that once haunted him. The night falls over London, the gas lamps casting warm halos on the wet cobbles. Somewhere nearby, a regiment is marching, its boots striking a perfect cadence. The sound blends with the memory of the rhyme until you can no longer tell where the real march ends and the imagined one begins. And as you turn a corner, you glimpse Frederick himself riding slowly through the park, saluting a few late strollers. His face is serious but calm, as though he, too, has made peace with the fact that history will always remember him this way, not as a hero or a villain, but as a story that people tell to their children, smiling as they do. It is a strange kind of immortality, but one that seems to suit him. You watch until he disappears into the dark, the sound of hooves fading, leaving behind only the faint, persistent rhythm of a song that will never quite stop playing. London's lamplight fades, and suddenly you are standing in a small country schoolroom, sunlight streaming through leaded windows, dust motes spinning lazily in the air. The floor is worn smooth by generations of children's boots, and on the slate board at the front is a scrawled verse. The grand old Duke of York. He had 10,000 men. The schoolmaster's voice drones on, but the children's faces are bright with mischief as they chant the rhyme in sing-song unison, stomping their feet at just the right moment. It has happened. The rhyme is no longer satire, whispered by weary soldiers or parody in a music hall. It is now part of childhood itself. You listen to the chant and feel the strange power of repetition. Each child here has no idea who Frederick was, no concept of Flanders mud or parliamentary debates, yet they carry his name forward like a baton in a relay race. The mainstream historical record tells us that the rhyme was first printed in the early 19th century, becoming a staple of nursery books by the Victorian era. You picture mothers rocking babies to sleep with it, governesses leading groups of children in clapping games, turning a once biting commentary on military futility into a harmless bit of exercise. And that's the odd magic of folklore. What begins as satire becomes tradition. You can almost see the rhyme evolving, verse by verse, as it spreads across the country. Some versions talk about marching them to the left and the right, others add hand motions or silly dances. Soon it is no longer about the Duke at all, but about the rhythm of going up and down, the eternal motion that is so satisfying to sing. The quirky detail here is that the rhyme even crossed oceans. Immigrants brought it to America, Australia, Canada, where children who had never heard of the Duke of York happily marched imaginary armies up imaginary hills. Historians still scratch their heads over how quickly it traveled, and how thoroughly it lost its original sting. Was it because Frederick himself became less controversial with time, or because British culture liked to turn its great embarrassments into endearing quirks? Either way, you can imagine some elderly veteran hearing the rhyme on a village green and chuckling to himself at the thought of how it all began. You step outside the schoolhouse and walk down a village lane where more children are playing the game. Up the hill, down the hill, giggling all the way. Their boots kick up dust, and their shouts carry on the summer air. The Duke's story has become a communal game now, something to laugh with rather than at. Back in London, print culture feeds the spread. Cheap illustrated chapbooks depict lines of soldiers like toy figures. The Duke, a rotund figure with a feathered hat, looking more like a jolly uncle than a serious commander. You stop at a stall near Fleet Street and flip through one such book, noting how the text has been stripped of any bitterness, no mention of failed campaigns, no hint of scandal, just the simple rhythm of up and down, like a lullaby. In a way, this is its own kind of redemption. Frederick's failures have been sanded down by time until only the shape of his story remains. His name is now shorthand for something gentle and predictable, a march that always ends where it began. It is a curious immortality, but a powerful one. There are many men who fought in Flanders, whose names are forgotten entirely, their deeds buried with them, But the Duke of York lives on, not in marble but in memory, repeated endlessly by small voices, who do not know they are keeping history alive. You wander into a music hall one evening, where a comedian is performing. The crowd roars with laughter as he breaks into the rhyme, exaggerating the motions, marching up and down the stage until his knees nearly buckle. The audience claps in time, some shouting extra verses of their own. The joke still works, but now it is good-natured, almost affectionate. The Duke has become a national mascot of sorts, his past mistakes now safely far enough away to be funny. And then you picture Frederick himself, older now, perhaps hearing the rhyme one last time near the end of his life. There is no record of how he felt about it, but you can imagine him smiling ruefully, perhaps shaking his head. Maybe he understood that this was the price of being a public figure, that your triumphs and failures are never entirely yours, that they belong to the people who watch you, who remember you, who turn your story into whatever they need it to be. Historians still discuss why this particular rhyme endured when so many others vanished. Was it the cadence, perfect for little marching feet? Was it the satisfying image of the hill? The sense of motion and futility captured so neatly in 2 lines? Or was it simply that the Duke of York was a safe figure to laugh at, royal enough to be grand, but not so important that mocking him felt dangerous? You stand once more at the top of an actual hill, watching the sunset wash the sky in gold. The village below is quiet now, smoke rising from chimneys, but you can still hear, faintly, the echo of children's voices, carrying the rhyme across the fields. The sound is haunting and comforting at once, a reminder that history is not just what is written in books but what is sung, what is played, what is remembered without thinking. As the last light fades, you imagine the Duke's ghost somewhere nearby, watching the children play, perhaps a little exasperated but secretly pleased that he is still known. After all, most people would be lucky to be remembered at all 200 years later, even in jest. You make your way back toward London as night falls, the stars pricking the sky above. The city is quieter now, at peace for the moment. But you know that the rhyme is still there, in nurseries, in playgrounds, ready to be passed on again tomorrow. And with every repetition, the Duke of York marches once more up, down, forever in motion, forever caught in that strange space between history and myth. By the time you reach the city gates, you almost find yourself humming along. The village children's voices fade into silence as you step into the heart of modern York, where the streets are narrow, the air carries the warm smell of bakeries, and the stones beneath your feet are worn smooth by centuries. Around you, reminders of the Duke's name are everywhere. There's a York Place, a Duke of York pub, a statue of a tall man in military dress gazing sternly into the distance. The nursery rhyme has taken his reputation and turned it into folklore, but the bricks and monuments tell a different story. A story of a man who was not just mocked, but memorialized. The mainstream historical record tells us that monuments to Frederick began appearing even during his lifetime. The most famous of them all is the Duke of York column in London, rising high above the Mall like a stone finger pointing toward the sky. You walk down the Mall now, the morning light catching the column's pale surface, and tilt your head back to see the bronze statue atop it. Frederick himself, cast in Roman-style armor, gazing outward over the city. There's something almost comical about the height of it. Londoners used to joke that it was built so tall to keep him as far from the army as possible. Yet, despite the joke, the monument is impressive. The column is one of the tallest in London, and climbing its internal spiral staircase is like walking through history itself, each step echoing against the hollow stone. When you reach the top, the view opens like a fan, the palace behind you, the parade ground before you, the Thames gleaming beyond. You can almost imagine Frederick himself looking out over the capital, satisfied that in some way, his work endures. The quirky detail about this column is that it was paid for in part by subscription from the army his soldiers contributed to it, a sign of how much they respected him by the end of his life. This is no small thing. Soldiers are often slow to forgive, and they have long memories for bad commanders. The fact that they were willing to pay for a monument to Frederick suggests that whatever their gripes about hills and marches, they believed he had improved their lives. Historians still debate whether the column is meant as honor or as gentle mockery. Some point out that its great height, which earned it the nickname the Whitest Elephant due to its expense, was controversial at the time. Others argue that its very presence in the ceremonial heart of London shows that Frederick's reputation had been rehabilitated, that he was no longer merely the butt of a rhyme, but a statesman remembered for shaping a modern army. You leave the mall and wander into a pub called the Duke of York, its sign creaking in the wind. Inside, the walls are lined with old prints and campaign maps, the air smelling of ale and wood smoke. There is something cozy about the place, as though the Duke's name has become a guardian spirit for good cheer and hearty food. You sit with a pint and watch the patrons laugh, a dog asleep by the hearth, and think how far Frederick has come from the days of being caricatured as a bungler. From there, you travel north, through towns where streets bear his name, past cottages with York View carved above the door. In some places, there are even regimental chapels dedicated to the men who served under him. Each of these is a little thread in the larger tapestry of his memory, a sign that the country did not forget him even if it remembered him in two different ways at once, as the builder of a professional army, and as the eternal marcher of nursery lore. You find yourself back at Horse Guards Parade, standing on the wide gravel where the Trooping the Color ceremony takes place every year. The buildings are the same ones Frederick knew, their pale facades glowing in the afternoon sun. You can almost see him striding across the parade ground, hands clasped behind his back, watching a line of scarlet-coated soldiers present arms. In some sense, every ceremonial parade held here is a living legacy of his insistence on drill, discipline, and spectacle, the idea that the army should not just fight well but look sharp doing it. The wind picks up, carrying the faint echo of drums, and you follow the sound to the guards' chapel nearby. Inside, the air is cool and smells of polish and candle wax. Plaques line the walls with the names of battles and of men who died in service, many from Frederick's era. You run your fingers over the engraved letters and realize that his work gave these names something to fight for. An army that functioned, that fed and clothed them better than before, that was not simply a dumping ground for the poor, but a professional career for men of ambition. The quirky thing about Frederick's memorialization is how ordinary it has become. For Londoners, the column is simply a landmark, the pubs simply good places to drink. The rhyme is just a rhyme, and yet, every one of these things is a thread that keeps his story alive. You wonder if he would have liked that he is remembered not as a towering, untouchable hero, but as a man woven into daily life, approachable, familiar. Historians still puzzle over why Frederick's reputation recovered as much as it did. Part of it, they say, is that the army he left behind was visibly better than the one he inherited. Part of it is that Britain eventually won the long war against Napoleon, and victors are generous in distributing credit. And part of it may simply be that time softens even the sharpest satire, turning a man once derided into a kind of national mascot. As evening falls, you walk once more along the mall. The column rises dark against the indigo sky, the figure at its top just visible in silhouette. The lamps throw golden pools of light on the pavement, and you hear the faint clip of hooves from the last changing of the guard. The city feels both ancient and eternal, and somewhere in the background, you can almost hear the voices of children singing again, their song drifting up to where the Duke of York stands immortal, bronze and silent, watching over the marchers below. By the time you turn to leave, you feel a kind of peace settle over the story. This is the point where memory has become architecture, where the Duke's life has been set in stone literally, and where all the hills he marched have led, at last, to a place where he cannot be brought down again. But there is one more chapter to walk through. How his story has echoed through time, not just in monuments and rhymes, but in the way people talk about power, folly, and perseverance. The shadows around the Duke of York column seem to lengthen as you walk, and suddenly, you are no longer standing in modern London but in a quieter, more somber version of it. The year is 1827, and the bells are tolling. The air feels heavy, as if the whole city has slowed its breathing. You see black drapes hanging from doorways, mourning bands on arms, and newspapers with bold black borders. Frederick, Duke of York, is dead. He had been ill for some time, suffering from dropsy edema, as we would call it now, and the disease had swelled his body painfully, leaving him confined to his home for much of his final year. You can picture him sitting in a chair near a tall window, gazing out at the gardens of his Oatlands estate, the winter light falling coldly across the floor. The man who had once ridden at the head of reviews, who had drilled regiments until their boots struck perfect cadence, was now unable to walk without difficulty. And yet those who visited him reported that he retained his dignity, greeting them with kindness, asking after the welfare of the army until nearly the last. The mainstream historical record describes how his death was widely mourned, and as you follow the funeral procession through London you see why. Soldiers line the streets, their scarlet coats vivid against the grey sky, muskets reversed in the traditional sign of respect. Crowds of citizens gather quietly, hats removed, watching as the coffin, draped in the royal standard, rolls by on a gun carriage. The muffled drums beat slowly, and each thud seems to echo through the city like a slow heartbeat. It is here that you feel the true measure of the man. For all the jokes, the scandals, the caricatures, London is giving him the funeral of a respected commander. The quirky detail that stays with you is the number of veterans who came out to watch, some limping on canes, some wearing bits of old uniform. They had marched under him, perhaps cursed him, perhaps sung about him in jest, but now they stand in silence as he passes, heads bowed. You follow the procession to St. George's Chapel at Windsor, where the air smells of candle wax and old stone. The choir sings, the words soaring into the vaulted roof, and the coffin is lowered into the vault. This is the last march, the final descent, and yet it feels less like defeat and more like rest. Historians still argue about Frederick's exact place in Britain's military history. Some insist that his campaigns were too disastrous to forgive, that his reputation as a strategist will always be poor. Others argue that his reforms mattered far more than his battlefield record, that without him, Wellington's victories in the Peninsular War might not have been possible. What is clear is that he left the army better trained, better organized, and better respected than he found it. You step back into the London streets a few weeks later, and find that the jokes have not entirely died away, but they are softer now, told with a kind of nostalgic affection. The rhyme is sung by children skipping rope, their voices carrying on the breeze, but even that feels like a memorial of sorts. Frederick's life has been distilled into an image of endless motion, of perseverance, no matter how pointless it may have seemed at the time. The city itself seems to join in the tribute. The column you saw earlier has not yet been erected. It will rise a few years later, in 1834, but you can almost see it already. The tall silhouette against the skyline, as though London knew it would need something permanent to remember him by. When it is built, it will be funded in part by the army he served. A final salute from the men who benefited from his reforms. You walk back to Horse Guards Parade one last time. The square is empty in the early dawn, the gravel pale under the first light. You imagine Frederick standing here, inspecting his troops, hearing the tramp of boots, feeling a swell of pride even as caricaturists sharpened their pens. The silence now feels like a fitting tribute. No more scandal, no more debate, just the quiet space where ceremony and memory meet. And then you hear it again, faint but insistent. The rhyme that has followed you through this entire journey. He marched them up to the top of the hill, and he marched them down again. It no longer sounds mocking. It sounds like a refrain. A reminder that life is motion, that history is repetition, that even failure becomes part of the rhythm that carries us forward. You turn away from Horse Guards and walk slowly through St. James's Park. The ducks are stirring on the water, the trees whisper in the early wind, and the sky above is painted in pale pink. This is the soft ending to a hard story, the cool down after the long march. And now, as promised, the final wind down. The pace slows, the words soften, and you feel the story settle like a blanket over your shoulders. The soldiers have all gone to their tents now, the torches guttering low. The Duke rests beneath his monument, high above them all, bronze gaze watching over the city. The hills he marched are long behind him, the roads he trod now quiet. The laughter of children singing his rhyme is a distant echo. The anger of Parliament faded into the archives, the mud of Flanders washed away by time. Breathe deeply. The air smells of rain on stone, cool and clean. The night is quiet, and the only sound is the faint rustle of leaves and the soft memory of drums keeping time. Whatever you think of Frederick, hero, bungler, reformer, or legend, he has done all the marching he will ever do. The story has come full circle, leaving you here in the calm after the storm. Let your shoulders loosen. Let the last images fade. The scarlet line of soldiers, the winding road, the great hills silhouetted against the sky. You are safe now, far from the mud and the noise, far from the jeers and the cheers alike. Close your eyes, let the final notes of the rhyme play in your head like a lullaby, and know that history has tucked itself in for the night. The march is over, the hill is climbed, The world is quiet.